Last Saturday, doing what I love doing in my garage, I put 650 kilograms of wood and drove it around for almost 2 weeks in the back of this. You understand what I'm saying? And as far as the noise and the vibration and the feel, the V8 is far nicer than this.
So, you've just found out that Toyota stopped making the LandCruiser a V8. So what do you get instead? You get something I'm about to show you in my beautiful workshop. You might remember this from a previous episode. And on that note, I have created a serum that changes your country of origin, as well as makes you 10 times the size. Marvelous. Now, as you can see, my miraculous growth... Yes, this is my miraculous growth serum, with a difference. Instead of making things bigger, this one shrinks them. But first...
Wait, hey, Juliet, I can't wait for him to crack his head on that.
Anyway, as I was saying, this is a miraculous shrinking potion. So prepare yourselves for a mini restoration project on this. Now this little midget chode thing is a Suzuki Sierra, and this is basically the failed abortion creation in the Jimny series. It's too new to have leaf springs, but it's too old to have a good coil spring setup. But this one is a little bit worse for wear in some areas. Like this one, and this one, and this one, and there, and there, and here. Doesn't matter for now, because that happens on all of these, regardless of how they've been treated in the past. This one may or may not have been a beach vehicle. So as we know, in any good vehicle project, step one in this is to jack off your car, something like that. So once again we find ourselves in the land of sketchy lifts. Some people might not see a problem with this, but the general rule is the smaller the car, the sketchier it is to lift on a hoist. Anyway, this is my genuine first time being under here. Looking a bit brown. Now this car has certainly been to Browntown, but we're going to fix that. And seeing as this car is going to be my new daily driver, I'm going to service it, just like I do everything else. At least whoever did the filter last didn't use tools. Click. And this is what 1.3 litres of carburetted engine looks like. They're nice enough to put the filler on the back of the engine just to make it as hard as possible to fill it. Hasn't been off in a while. Probably should have checked these things before I bought it. Now, aside from looking like it's never had a hot bath in its life, maybe this is impossible to see with a camera, but everything inside there looks relatively good. Doesn't seem sludgy at all. Obviously at some point I'm going to take this rocker cover off and have a proper look, and also do the timing belt. But until then, it's okay enough. I have no idea of the capacity of this. I'm guessing it's about 4 litres. That feels like 4 litres. That's hard to see. I got it pretty close. And this brings us to the next part of the story. It doesn't run. It used to run, but it doesn't now. Basically, when I got it, it was idling at about 2,500 RPM, which is obviously not ideal. So I was adjusting the cold and hot idle down the back of the carb there, when suddenly, it just died, and it hasn't started since. And I was convinced I'd found the problem when I found this broken and hastily repaired wire, which I have repaired in an even more hasty way. But it still didn't help, even though I was so confident it would fix it. Now, my magical fuel in a can did not work when sprayed in there, which leads me to think that it's ignition related. So, the first step in my funky diagnosis: find if I have voltage to the coil. You can with a little zoom. Now, with the ignition on, which it is, I should have 12 volts at the coil, which I do. So this means that this coil is getting a charge. I should probably actually check to see if it does have a proper spark, rather than just guessing by spraying deodorant in the intake, just in case something weird is happening. That's a slightly oily plug, but it doesn't look like it's burning too badly. Gap should be 0.8, looks a little bit big, it looks more like 1 millimeter. I'll check with a feeler gauge, but I doubt this is the sort of thing that'll stop it from running. Get out of there, you! Don't know about you, but I'm not seeing a spark there. Not feeling one either. I'm going to try it in a different spot just to make sure it's actually got a ground. Nope, definitely no spark. The deodorant can method holds true. Now, if I've got power here, this is trying to charge the middle of this distributor cap. And this means that there's either nothing telling it to spark, or this isn't working at all. So I'm going to get a bit of very fine sandpaper and just clean up these little contacts in here, especially that middle one. This one's on a spring so that it puts pressure on this contact of the rotor, and then as this rotates, it'll distribute a spark where it needs to go. Now, the movement here is what's taken up by the vacuum timing advance. Now, whatever position this is in, it's not going to affect whether it's got a spark or not. It's just whether you're firing before or after top dead center. So whatever's going on here will not cause the symptoms that I'm getting. Good thing I've got a never-ending supply of these from my sanding escapades.
Sanding, more sanding. And when you think you're done, more sanding. Sand until there's nothing left. Sand until you
Reach your death. Anyway, that didn't help, so I gave up and decided to do something else. This included removing a lot of flakes from underneath the car, like an extremely iron oxide-based dandruff.
Super Team Extraordinaire, Freakazoid, Freakazoid, runs around in underwear, Freakazoid, Freakazoid, then she's watching to be seen, Freakazoid, Freakazoid, and that's something that is on TV, Freakazoid, Freakazoid, his brain's overloaded, it has a chocolate coating, textbook case for Sigmund Freud.
So I've had to give this the good from far, far from good thing and just cover it in zinc paint basically, because that'll hopefully prevent any rust from spreading. Looks not bad at a glance, but obviously when you get close there's all overspray and horrible things. But when I go and do this project properly, I'm going to take all this stuff out, strip it and redo it. And eventually I'm going to take the body off the chassis. And what that'll let me do is address all of this surface rust that's in here. There's a fair bit. I mean, I know it's not bad. It looks much worse than it is just because it's dirty on top of it. But I've been through it all really carefully and there's no penetrating rust. It just looks bad. Speaking of rust that looks bad, it's time to address you.
Actually, it's not, because my ADHD brain kicked in and I got distracted.
I'm not trying to diagnose anything here. I'm just having a look at the condition of it. And I've seen a lot worse than that. That's pretty decent. So, it's a new day in the workshop of dreams. You can tell because I sometimes change my clothes. Anyway, I've solved it. So basically the engine was running, and then it decided to die while I was adjusting the two idle screws in there. So basically you've got one for the cold idle and one for the hot idle. And I figured, oh, I've knocked something around there. So I undid every adjustment that I did, and it still wouldn't work. I thought I didn't have a spark, but it turns out I did have an extremely weak spark. From there, I've checked all the plug gaps, checked all the carb settings, cleaned out the distributor cap, checked all the leads. I've got 12 volts going into here and 12 volts coming out of there. So what could cause this? Well, this is the coil from the TB42 on the Nissan Patrol. I kind of jerry-rigged that up, and I went from having an extremely weak spark to having a nice big fat spark. And then I turned the key and it fired up almost immediately. Now I'm going to replace this coil eventually with a original style one, same as this. because I don't like putting pins in plugs. But this is just to get it running. Arguably the most outrageous hack job I've done in a while. So with all of that rubbish out the way, this car should now start. Now I'm not quite sure, but there might be a slight exhaust leak going on there. Anyway, it's now running like shit. I better redo those adjustments I did before the last time it died. Now I've never personally experienced a coil failure like this, but if it works... Now this coil failure could have only been caused by one thing. Wizards. So I'm not going to question it, but it's fixed. So here's the next piece of this puzzle. Rust. And you might think this is the worst you've ever seen, but for a Suzuki, this is not that terrible. On the other side you can see this plastic panel that I've half pulled off, but when that's in place, you can't even see the rust. So any one of these that you see that still has that stock piece of trim, chances are it's the same, if not worse, underneath. So I'm not quite decided what I'm going to do about this yet. What I'm going to do is chop bits away and then decide once I've chopped everything out to see how bad it is. Now, a lot of people replace it with a bit of angle, but I'm trying to avoid doing that because I want to use the plastic panels and I want it to look factory. But as a last resort, I might have to do that. Now you might be thinking to yourself, that looks absolutely bloody terrible. But what you have to remember is that this is just a runaround car, and I'm not going to be doing this to the same standard as this. So what I'm going to do is stop this getting any worse, and I'm going to coat the shit out of it with a bunch of etch primer, and then follow it up with a lot of zinc paint. Because this car is going to get a full makeover in the near future, but for now, it's not. So today is a relatively sad day. I just took the car for a pink slip just to see what it needed, and it failed. And here's the list. Rust. Now I know I could easily go to a less harsh inspector or just get an unseen pink slip because it's easy enough to do these days, but instead I've decided to address these very valid concerns. So what does that mean? It means I'm going to take the body off. I would have preferred not to, but I pretty much have to fix half of the rust that's there. Now with any luck, because this is the simplest car in the world, this is going to be quite easy to do. The main thing I'm going to do is take off the air conditioning compressor and just leave that to the side, because otherwise I have to regas it, and I'd rather not do that. But aside from that, I think there's a chance I could leave the whole cooling system in place. And then I basically disconnect this, undo the body mounts, and that's it. And obviously the steering. So I'm going to do what I can here and then lift the body off. Permanently fixed. Now these two are going to be the scariest body mounts to do because I'm betting that loads of sand has accumulated on top of there and they're going to be rather brown and crusty, much like the rest of this car. Well, it turns out those aren't the body mounts. Those are instead. So, that's a body. That's a chassis. Tune in next time to find out what ungodly discoveries are found on this horrible body. Don't worry, there'll be more V10 stuff, but I have to make this 2 or 3 part little series so I've got a little car to play with.